So welcome to Strategies for Improving Math, Language, and Comprehension. Meagan and I are very excited to be here to talk about this at Language and Lit. I am Lindsey Pust, and I am the Atlas Numeracy and Special Projects Coordinator. Before that, I was in the classroom for about 10 years teaching all the subjects, but had a special fondness for math. So, and then I'm joined by Meagan.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Meagan Hymes. I am the ABE program supervisor for Metro North Blaine, but very recently, previously, I'm a classroom ABE teacher, mainly teaching in corrections, so one-room schoolhouse corrections, all the levels, all the things. And I too have a fondness for math. So thank you for being here.
All right, so we are going to take a little bit of time to kind of set the stage, introduce you to our thoughts for this workshop and kind of setting it up. And then we're going to experience several different activities. The first being one about number lines, where you're going to get to be the students, and we're really going to focus on language that we use to describe the math and what's happening. And then we will focus on some story problems and talk about providing structure to further develop that language and application. And we'll spend a little bit of time at the end to just debrief and wrap up. So that's the plan for today. And our objectives, we really want to identify the importance of student participation in sense making in numeracy and getting their involvement. Utilizing language strategies to improve student comprehension of math vocabulary and concepts, and just to have opportunities to network with colleagues and discuss how is this relevant to my setting. So again, you'll be in several breakout rooms, but also just through the chat and in our reflection at the end, just being able to kind of hear what other people are doing and what other people are thinking about these ideas. So, setting the stage, why address language and numeracy together? And if we're thinking about numeracy, not necessarily like everybody has to take calculus, but what if you think about numeracy as the counterpart to literacy, what math is required for just all of us to be able to make sense of throughout life, because we're encountering numbers all the time. So like how can I encounter numbers and make sense of them as they come up in my life? And so that's one of the first reasons, right? Like everyday numeracy demands are rarely disconnected from language. So talking about that numeracy, that everybody needs it, but then addressing language alongside of it is incredibly important. College and career goals, right? Being able to communicate around numeracy is expected at most jobs and schools. Interpreting news, knowing how to respond to what we're hearing. We're thrown stats all the time, and being able to be able to critically think about them is very important. Informed citizenship, right? Like understanding issues, policies, arguments. It informs how we vote, because a lot of arguments that are made, people are throwing in numbers and statistics and trying to convince us of things. And then personal agency, which is incredibly important. Being able to determine your actions based on your own knowledge, right? And owning your own decisions. It's just priceless. So just a few reasons why it's like, this is really important. And obviously you think it is too, because you're here. So we're excited. I will just give you a moment. I'm not going to read this slide, but I'll just give you a moment to kind of glance over this slide. These are some standards we pulled out that we are hitting today on some level. So I'll give you a moment to kind of scan that. There's a lot of things happening with these activities. And I'm sure with things that you're doing in your classroom, like we're rarely just looking at one standard, right? There's so much overlap between activities and skills and what we're doing. Okay, so now we get to, I'm really excited for this, by the way. Now we get to put our student hats on. And we're going to do an activity. So you're going to be using the chat a lot. So if you haven't already, open up your chat. And I'm going to ask some questions for you to respond to. So there will be some large group activity that we're doing with this large group time that we're doing with this activity, but then there also will be some time where you get to talk with just a few colleagues. But we'll have our student hats on for a while. So here we go. Looking at this image, you can use any words, including ones that are not English, and write a sentence in response to this question. How could you describe where M is in the row? So I'll give you a moment to type your response and put it in a sentence. Maybe you start with M is blank, or an equivalent in not English, in another language. I see some answers coming in. Awesome. M is in the middle. I see a lot of M is in the middle. M is in the middle of a row of 5 letters. M is the 3rd letter from the left and is in the middle. M is behind the blue chair and between the X and the H. Oh, they're coming in fast. I'm sorry, I can't read them all. M is between H and X, right? So you have this M is between, M is behind the blue chair, right? So there's this blue chair. I've done this activity. Well, I'm not going to come out of student mode. Just kidding. Okay, M is in the middle. Nope, I lost it. I'm sorry. Go past I and H in the top row. Okay. Okay, so now the next question, you'll see the image changed a little bit. And now there are numbers also in another row on the bottom. So you can use your own statement that you just made, M is blank, or you can, maybe you want to use one of your classmates that you saw come in the chat because you like what they said. But now instead of putting M is, I want you to replace it with 3 is. How would you describe where 3 is? 3 is the median of 5 numbers. Ooh, using the word median. 3 is directly below the M. Okay, I'm sorry if I do not pronounce this correctly, but I want to say it. 3 está abajo de la M. I love that. 3 is between 2 even numbers. 3 is in the middle. 3 is in the row in front of M. Okay, so we have a lot of in the middle of the bottom row. Under, in front of, between. Okay, that's awesome. So thank you for sharing those. Now, 3 is in the middle between 2 and 4. Okay, so there were a lot of us that said middle, right? So I'm now going to give you some math language. Okay, so I'm going to give you some vocabulary words that we can use to describe where 3 is. Okay, these are just a few. There are more, but we're going to focus on 4. So instead of saying 3 is in the middle, for example, another way that we could say that using more math language, we could say 3 is halfway between 2 and 4. So that means that 3 is in the middle of 2 and 4. It's halfway between these two numbers. Another way to say the same thing, you could say 3 is equidistant to 2 and 4. Equidistant, what does EQUI, what kind of word does that remind you of? What does that sound like? Equal, yeah. So there's equal distance between 3 and 2 and 3 and 4. So those are other ways of saying 3 is in the middle. I'm going to give us 2 more vocabulary words that we can use to describe where is 3 in relation to the other numbers. We could say 3 is 1 less than 4. 3 is 1 less than 4. Or 3 is 1 greater than 2. 3 is 1 greater than 2. So as we move to the right, our numbers are getting bigger. So these 4 words we're going to practice using today to describe where are these numbers in relation to each other. So now I want you to choose one of these vocabulary words, these 4, halfway between, equidistant to, less than, or greater than. And I want you to think, what else can we say about 3 in this picture? Using one of these words, but writing a different statement. I see some answers coming in. Three is 2 less than 5. Now we're going 2 less, two numbers, 2 whole numbers less than 5. 3 is halfway between 1 and 5. 2 is 1 less than 3. So we could say 3 is 1 greater than 2 if we're describing where 3 is, but that is an accurate statement. 2 is 1 less than 3. 3 is greater than 1 and less than 5. Okay, good. So I'm going to now give you a chance in breakout groups to verbally practice using these vocabulary words. Okay, so with 3 on a number line, what new ways could you use to describe where 3 is? Okay, now the number line changed. Now we have a different image. I have more numbers. Okay, I have 1 through 10. So with this visual, you're going to answer the same question. And I am going to project my screen to your breakout room. So all you have to do is think about this question and then discuss possible answers with your peers. This is the screen you will see in your breakout room. The vocabulary words are on the top to remind you. And there are some sentence starters here. So you'll see this screen. And then about halfway through the breakout time, you're going to see the screen change because I'm going to ask you a new question. So if it moves, it was supposed to move. Okay. So to share my screen into your breakout room, there'll be about a 30-second delay, but then you should see it. Okay. So we can get set here. All right. So I would like to know if anyone would be willing to share some examples in the chat, specifically for this one, about other numbers. When you use other numbers and our vocabulary words, if you could put some examples in the chat of what your group shared. How did you write relationship statements? Oh, so writing a question. What is 7 greater than 3? What else? 5 is equidistant from 1 and 9. 5 is equidistant from 1 and 9. Do people agree with that statement that Krista made, that 5 is equidistant from 1 and 9? How far away is 5 from 1? How many spaces? How many whole numbers? Our number line does not start at 0. Okay. So 5 is how many whole numbers away from 1? 4 whole numbers. And how many whole numbers away from 9? 4. So it is equidistant. 10 is greater than all the other numbers. Good observation about 0 not being on the number line. Where would 0 be if it was on the number line? It would be less than 1. So that would be to the left of 1. And it would have to be the same distance. So I'm estimating here that there would be 0. Good. All right. So the next question I have is, what would it look like to create sentence frames with no numbers in them? So we're going to actually look at a sentence frame for each. We're not going to look at them. We're going to create them. A sentence frame for each of these vocabulary words. How could I write a sentence frame with blanks in them? No numbers. What would it look like for us to do halfway between? So, for example, maybe I write blank is halfway between blank and blank. No numbers, but I am writing a sentence where I could put numbers in there to describe a relationship on the number line. How would we write one for equidistant to? What could we say? You can type in the chat. What would that look like? no numbers, but a sentence we could use for all numbers. Okay, blank is equidistant to blank and blank. And I like where you're going with that, Adam. And we could even put blanks for the 1 and the 9, depending on what numbers we're choosing. So blank, it helps if you click, there we go. Blank is equidistant to, okay. What about less than? How could we write one with less than? Oh, okay. We have a couple different answers. Blank is blank less than something, right? So I can then decide how much less it is than another number. And Linda, yes, you have the right idea. We could even take the 2 out to make it even more general. All right. We could say blank is blank spaces less than, right? We're talking about whole numbers. Okay, and then the last one, what about greater than? Oh, Mara, I see another one. Blank is to the left of blank, this number, so it is less than. I like that relationship. A number to the left is less than a number to the right. And then you wrote the opposite. Blank is to the right of, so then it is greater than another number. Okay, and we could also put blank is greater than blank. Awesome. So these are sentences that we can now use for any number on the number line to describe the relationship to each other. So we will come back to that, but I want to have us pause, take our student hat off for just a second, and as you're thinking about one or both of these questions, if you have a comment on them, please put them in the chat. Like, how are the numeracy language and language components working together? There's still an extension that we're going to do after these reflection questions. We'll put our student hat back on in just a moment, but I just want to pause right here for a moment. If you have any thoughts on that question, or how implementing this part of the routine would be beneficial or challenging for your students, you can put ideas in the chat. I do want to say that we're going through this sequence, and this is an activity that I got that I learned from an NCTM webinar that I went to, and I linked to it at the end of the slides. So this is not my idea, but I adapted it, and I like this idea of including students in making the sentence frames to describe relationships between numbers on a number line. But I also want to recognize, like, we've done a lot in a very little bit of time. And so depending on the level of your learners, this would not be too much, or this would be way too much to do all at once, right? So like you would have to adapt the pieces of it. But any thoughts? So Sarah says, by articulating relationships, I think students are getting at a deeper understanding of the number line. Yes, that is like the beauty of this language and numeracy coming together. Because number lines, regardless of the level of student that I've worked with, this is a general statement. There are exceptions to this. but many students struggle with the number line, right? Regardless. Numeracy and language components work together as a translation system where language explains the numeracy. It's directional to the left, to the right, common words that students will recall to figure out, and then visually see new math terms like greater than, less than, equidistant, halfway. Yes, letting them use language they know and then saying, oh, and then this means the same thing, or this is how we can now describe what you already know. The more students use the vocabulary, the more likely they will understand it while reading on their own. Yes, it improves reading comprehension for math. Okay, I love it. It's like I planted you all, but I'm really glad that the impact is coming through, because when I experience this, I'm like, what? This is amazing. Okay, so we're going to put our student hats back on. We're going back into the activity. So now I'm pressing play again on student mode. And one moment before we do this, okay, I want to say also, you'll see in the number line, whoa, we just took a big jump. We went from 1 to 10 to 0 to 1,000. Okay, we're going to do this, but you, again, know your students best. Like you might go to 20 or to 15. Like you don't have to use this, but these are the examples that we're going to see now to see how far could we take this. Okay, so student hats back on. Using what you know, and this is an individual thing, so don't say anything yet in the chat, but using what you know about the other numbers that are on the number line, and you can use estimation strategies. Where would you put 375 on this number line? Okay, and I want you to think about this. Maybe you jot it on a piece of paper. You can use any language you would like to at first, but just think, how would I describe where 375 is using any language? So I'll give you a minute to think just individually. Okay, now I want you to put your thoughts into one of our sentence frames. So I'm actually going to go back and grab these sentence frames and put them on this screen. And I will make it, okay. So I want you to use one of these sentence frames to describe where would 375 be on this number line. And feel free to write your thoughts and put it in the chat. I'll give you some time. I said in the chat, but I'm actually going to ask someone to unmute. Thank you for putting that in the chat, because I did say that. If you are willing to unmute, I'm going to ask for 1 or 2 people to share. Could you just put me in the chat or raise your hand to help share your thinking? You can say no, but Maura, would you be willing to unmute and share?
Sure. So the first thing I thought of is 375 is less than halfway on this number line, but I thought I should describe the number line as well. So I said less than halfway on the number line to 1,000.
Okay, now what would halfway be on this number line from 0 to 1,000?
Good question. 500.
Okay, 500. Now, how do you know where? I'm sorry, I'm treating you like a student, right?
That's
I know
fine.
you know this. I know you know this. Where would 500 be on this number line?
Well, let me see. I'm going to move the chat out of my way so I can see the whole number line. So let's
Yeah.
see, it's divided into 10 pieces, I think, right? The number line is in 10 pieces. So I'm going to say that it would be at the 5th line. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 500. So it's divided into hundreds.
So when you say piece, are you talking about this?
Yes.
So there's 10 pieces.
Yes.
So 5 pieces in, if
Yeah.
each of these are 100,
Yes.
then 500 would be right here.
Yes.
So 375
Yes.
is, I'm going back to where you said, is less than halfway. So it's
Yeah.
somewhere over here.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
And then Jean, would you be willing to unmute? You can say no, but would you be willing to unmute?
Okay.
And my question for you is, how did you decide that 375 is greater than 300, but less than 400? So where, not how did you decide? I'm going to rephrase my question. Where between 300 and 400 would it be?
Well, we would have to mark the middle first. We'd have to mark the very middle between 300 and 400 as 350 first.
Oh, so halfway between 300 and 400 is 350?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then if we think about quarters, we could think about halfway between 350 and 400 and mark that halfway point. And that's where we could put 375.
Huh. So both of you, thank you for sharing that, Jean. So both of you were using halfway relationships, right? To figure out where would 375 be on this number line. That's awesome. That's a great strategy to figure out where it would be. Okay, and thank you to everybody who wrote in the chat as well. So I want you to think about this question, okay? We are gonna go into a breakout room. There's 2 more questions with this number line activity, and you will see both of them in your breakout room. So it'll be the exact same. I will project to your breakout room. Halfway through, I will change the screen. But I want you to think about where you would plot the number 35 on this number line, and really pay attention to, really be intentional about using these vocabulary words in your explanation to each other, okay? So, Marisa, I will let you.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, well, welcome back. I hope that your breakout room discussions were fun and interesting. We are gonna not share out as a large group on this one, but again, you can see that this is an even more abstract number line. So depending on your students, like, you know your students best and how far you would take this routine, but this could start with students that are studying for their GED, but maybe don't have a grasp of the number line, like a strong grasp of it. So you could start with from the beginning of this activity, but then keep making it more and more difficult, right? To kind of be able to give them language to describe where numbers are in relation to each other. Or you could start with where we started, and again, then progress to 0 to 20 or something like that. So depending on your students, you can alter that. So the last couple minutes of this, and then we will take a break before we get into story problems. I want to know if, Maura, you have a great question, and I'm gonna answer that how I would answer it, but other people can also put their own responses in the chat, or Meagan, you can chime in as well. But as I'm talking about Maura's question, I want you to think about these questions on the screen. They're very similar to what we did about halfway between, but if you have any new comments and you are willing to unmute and share, I would love to hear from 1 or 2 people. So you could put like me in the chat. I'd be willing to share my reflection of this activity, or you can raise your hand. But I'm looking for 1 to 2 people to comment on one of these questions. Okay. So while you're thinking about if that's you, responding to a very wrong answer, I think my first question would be, how did you get that? Or what were you thinking? Or not what were you thinking, but how did your thinking lead you there? Because then sometimes a very wrong answer actually starts with a correct premise, but it just kind of gets lost a little bit or misdirected. So I would want to understand more about what the student was thinking, because sometimes those very wrong answers aren't actually that wrong. And then it's honoring their thinking and gives you some time to think about, okay, well, what piece of this can I validate and then redirect? So I would ask them to explain more, say more. How did you get there? That's how I would answer that or respond in that situation. Okay, I don't see anybody jumping for like sharing and unmuting.
Lindsey, I'll say something.
Yes, go for it.
Okay. Well, I think the benefits is that there's just so many perspectives that students can give, like thought processes. So you get to hear all of that. And you kind of collaborate, like, well, how did you come up with, thinking that way? And then it gives students another chance to take a different angle to it. I think sharing like that is beneficial. But the other thing is some challenges is like, even with the number line, we were talking in our group, a lot of times students don't start at 0. They think they can start at 1, but then it throws the whole thing off. So one suggestion was playing like literally tape on the floor, and you start at the start line at 0, and then you jump to the numbers. And that's when we start counting, so they're actually counting 1. Whereas normally they're starting at 1 and not counting that. So yeah, just
no. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm gonna push back just a tiny bit, because depending on the goal and the understanding of your students, like knowing where 0 is, and then like where is 1, where is 2, like knowing that is incredibly important. And that's probably what you're describing, like where is 1, how do I get to 1?
Yeah.
If students are only seeing that, so I think that's what you're describing, but then going further down the line, if students are only seeing number lines start at 0, then it's harder to jump to the abstract of like seeing a piece of a number line, like maybe 500 to 1,000 or something that really it goes on in both directions. So I'm not always going to see things start at 0, but if I'm beginning my number sense, then I can see, and I need to know like where is 1, then that makes sense, because then you also want to be able to keep their understanding open to accept negative numbers that are
absolutely
below 0. So
yeah.
I think we're saying the same thing. I'm just expanding.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing. And then Jean, you can be the second person. I see you said me.
Well, thanks. And I appreciate Emily's comments, because she was talking, she referred to putting tape on the floor, which I love, because we are navigating sometimes in-person instruction, but also the online instruction. I have a background in teaching math, and I have also taken the STAR classes, and I teach STAR. So to me, this is like incorporating STAR in math, which I love because I've been thinking about incorporating STAR in math for a long time. And so I think that it improves number sense, it increases reading comprehension. And then from a Google Meet perspective or Zoom teaching, it keeps the student actively engaged.
Thank you for sharing that. Yes, and I didn't do this today. I didn't know everybody's Zoom permissions, because sometimes it's just like it doesn't show up for people. But annotating, it would also be great to have students, if you're online, having them, whether it's on your screen or maybe you're using Jamboard or some other platform where they can collaborate, then they can be marking, well, where would you put 375? And okay, about right there. Okay, why? And so that they're then kind of writing on the screen can be helpful, or coming to the board can be helpful. But yes, so many adaptations. So I'm glad that this was interactive and that you see connections to STAR as well. That's so great. Well, thank you very much for all of your comments. We will take a break. So come back in 10 minutes.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you have found yourself warmed up your beverage or taken a stretch or done what you needed to do. I'm just gonna jump right in here, and we will have a little bit of time at the end too for questions. So if something came to you during the break, we will still have time to address any of those in the session here. So because we are running ahead of schedule. Yay. All right, so I'm Meagan, and just to give you a little bit of context here, we're about to dive into some structure for story problems. And I like to just set up, sometimes people are like, wow, this is all over the place a little bit. I teach in corrections, and my most recent roster had a student who is pre-lit and speaks very little English, all the way to students who were taking GED tests and everything in between, all in one classroom. So a lot of the time when I have my teacher hat on, I am trying to figure out how can I level things so that everyone in the room is getting something out of it. And so that's where some of this comes from. So in thinking about your own context, right, some of this will apply, some of this won't, but I'm also trying to think about, multiple levels out there. And then in addition to that, so we spent the morning with Lindsey's amazing session on thinking about the number line, which is, I think, a really great routine to have in any classroom at any level for continuing to build language, because you can level it up, you can level it down. It has many, many access points. And you had your student hats on, and thank you for all that participation. For this part of it, we're going to go back and forth a little bit between our teacher brains and our student brains, or not that they're really separate, but our teacher hats and student hats. And also, I'll let you know when to think in which direction. So, story problems, all right, so let's go ahead. Next slide, Lindsey, please. So when we think about math standards, right, I've mushed them all into 4 big points here, but when we think about math standards and career readiness, right, these are the things that we are aiming to get our students ready to do. And I'm not going to read this off to you, you can read it, but the biggest hurdle often is the first one, especially when it comes to story problems, is making sense of the problem and then persevering in solving it. Because students get stuck. They see the words in front of them. And I don't know how many times I've heard from a student like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Or, I hate word problems. I hate story problems. And it's because this first hurdle for them is really just making sense of the problem. And so in thinking about that, one of the biggest pieces of that, next slide, Lindsey, is the language piece, which, right, we've already been talking about and playing with all morning, is if we can get students more comfortable, and it even came up in the chat, many of you are already thinking in this direction. If we can keep building those language pieces for students, it will give them more comfort, more confidence, and help them push past this making sense of word problems and persevering in solving them. Because the biggest piece is the language hurdle. And so in thinking about that, right now in the chat, I'm just going to start with, and I tend to, in my classroom, use as many visuals as I can. The goal for me is to get students to be able to show me their thinking. And one of the best ways to get them to understand what I mean by that is by giving them visuals to draw from. And so the more visuals they can see and interact with, then if I'm asking them to show me their thinking, they can draw back on some visual they saw. I'm like, oh, I could show it this way, or maybe I could draw this picture. Because the more they can get things down on paper or show some sort of model or representation, again, they can apply that language, and the easier it is for them to persevere in solving the problem. So next slide. So right now in the chat, I'd just like you to describe anything that you see in this image. And some of you may be familiar with some practices that teachers use with notice and wonder. And I'm going a little bit in that direction right now, but really just anything, describe anything you see in this image. And you can put on your student hat and think what your students might say, but really anything at this point, anything that you see. Yes, it's a pattern. There's blue and red dots, 2 dots and 1 red dot. There's repetition. There's something repeating already, right? There's all of this math language coming out. Oh, nice. Krista, I noticed the pattern. AAB, AAB, AAB. Very nice, right? Possibly also getting into higher level thinking. 10 space bar with 3 red circles, yeah. 30% red dots. Circles together. Great, this is awesome. Because you're already in your chat showing that just a simple image like this can access so much language. And sometimes students just don't even realize the language that they possess in order to describe things. And so by starting out with images and not having words in front of them is a great way to get them going, like, oh, and even making a list. Look at all this language you've already come up with, right? Repetition, repeating. Someone said 30%, right? They don't even have to know what that means. If one person in the classroom says it and someone else is like, how do you see 30%? Because you can get to that. But just that there's all these different pieces of language that apply to just this picture here, to just this image. Yes, 3 out of the 10 are red, see, and then you could explain it. And also if you don't explain it, right, that's not even necessary at this point. Sometimes too, is just getting students going, recognizing like, oh, we have some language. And or if you're using like number line routine every day in your classroom, or on the days that you do numeracy, which would be great if you're doing it every day, but if not, if you only do it certain days of the week, building on that. And then when you get to your lessons, right, okay, let's draw from that language now, having that bank of language to draw from. And so thank you for all. Next slide, Lindsay, for being busy in the chat there. 3.7. Oh, nice. Thank you, Carol. And so a lot of times though, what will happen is you'll put something up like that in your classroom and the students say nothing, right? And in my classroom, you don't have to use this verbiage, but I call it a brain jam. And I say, instead of like a brain fart or whatever, but I say brain jam because jam, the word itself means something is stuck. It doesn't mean it's not capable. It just means it's stuck and you have to figure out how to help get it out, right? I see something, but how do I describe it? Or I think that means something, but how do I articulate what that means or show what that means? So we call it a brain jam because students will say like, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do, again, with story problems, right? Where do I begin? And the, just making sure I'm checking the chat here. And the biggest piece of this is just letting students know, like what kind of support can you give them, right? So you guys already this morning were working hard on building sentence frames. And so now this is what I bring to students. Next slide. Give them the language, right? You can use routines in your classroom to build the language, but then also if you're working on story problems, there's nothing wrong with giving them the language. This right now on this slide is something that I give to my students and is displayed when we are working, depending on the level of students I'm working with, is displayed and what problem we're working with. So the students have these to draw from. And the columns are set up for them. Where can I start? And then how can I describe this, right? And so again, if you're using these in tandem with what we were doing this morning, students are getting used to sentence frames, what those sentence stems, what those mean, how to build them. And you can even provide your, you can make your own chart from something that you're building in your classroom, and then let them build a chart for themselves, provide them with the language. So they can be like, I don't know where to start. Oh, let me, like on this chart here. Okay, what is the same? What is different? That's one place to start, right? Are there groups? Can I make groups or can I take groups apart? And again, it's just giving them the language and a place to start and then a language to describe so that they can start, diving in deeper to the language that you're building with them. Next slide. So right now, you're going to go into breakout groups. You'll have 5 minutes. And again, on the slide here, and you'll see it'll be a little bit of a delay, but then there will be a projection into the room. And I want you to now put on your student hat and be thinking about, and up in the right-hand corner of the slide, you can see, here are some sentence stems. And think about these questions and how you could use these sentence stems to describe this image that you're seeing. So off you go. Thank you.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I know 5 minutes isn't a lot of time, but the idea here is just to give you a few moments to sort of play around with these ideas and think about how they might apply to your students. So here, and you can feel free to type in the chat anything that was interesting that you would like to share that came out of your breakout room. This was the most recent responses. So in a group of students that I had, here were some of the responses that came from students. And like all the squares have 4 gray squares. Great, right? It's again, thinking in groups, right? And then pointing out to them. So it's using that language like, oh yes, right? Oh, all of them have 4 gray squares. Great, so each of them has a group of 4. Right, and again, giving them that language, they're telling you what they're noticing, they're using those sentence stems, and then you're pushing it further by giving them more language even to describe what they're talking about. Unlike the small square, right, the big square has more black squares. On the big square, I see 4 groups of 3. Right, now not every student is going to necessarily have that language right off the bat. But again, these are just some sample responses that I've had from students in the classroom that they can come up with the language, right? On the middle square, I see 4 groups, but each group has 2. And that response came after. So hearing student 3 talk about the big square, then another student was like, oh, and on the middle square, I see 4 groups. And so they're also going to be borrowing from each other and learning from each other. Especially if you have, well, all of us, no matter what you're teaching, have multi-levels within our room, right? So again, too, even learning from other students in the room, drawing from those language pieces. And again, right, it's a simple visual. It's nothing really tricky about it, but it's it's really great for getting them thinking about, oh, how can I describe this? What about that language? And setting them up. So this would be more for lower level when you're just trying to aim at, you know, building that language and those sentence stems. And then the next slide here is getting a little bit higher story problem experience. So if you will in the chat right now, oh, wait, hold on one second. So one of us had started a glossary for, oh, yes, nice, great. So even, right, I have the charts that I hand out to students and that I display, but here's an offering that, right, someone had a glossary for her students, and having an access to a glossary, that's an excellent idea. Just anything to give them tools, right? We're trying to provide them with tools and, you know, to keep pushing their learning forward. One thing I want to say about this slide here is that I always try to, and I said this at the beginning, is that I always try to use story problems that have visuals to begin with before I dive straight into just all words. And because the visuals give them that opportunity, but also because for any of you who work in ABE, you know, they have to take a test. And whether it's, you know, TABE, CASAS, or GED, they're always going to be visuals. A lot of the time there are charts attached to the problem. And oftentimes students overlook those. So I typically structure my word problems by always showing them the visual first when we're doing a lesson and getting them to talk about the visual, because in practice that gets them right moving forward. It trains them or trains their brain like, oh, let me look at that visual. What's that visual telling me? Great, thank you for already starting to share here. Oh, ratios, yes, for that last visual, absolutely. Again, you can hit multiple levels with these things. And then apply them to word problems. And the areas, oh my gosh, you guys are all brilliant. I'll just stop presenting now. So no, thank you for that. Yeah, again, right, multiple access points for all kinds of things you could do here. I'm so glad it sounds like the chat rooms were very, very active. Yay. Okay, in the chat now, moving on to this visual. So I've cut this off of a story problem. This is the visual that's attached to the story problem, but I would just be displaying this to the students. And so now in the chat, if you could tell me anything at all that you notice about this graph, and even specifically, like, do you see any groups or groupings, any patterns or absence of patterns? Or what do you wish you knew about the graph? So feel free right now, taking a look at this graph, to put in the chat anything, and even if it's something outside of these questions that I've posted here, anything you notice at all about this graph. And it could even just be something about the axis, or it has an axis, or maybe you don't even know what that is. So an increase, and again, here's more language, right? An increase in travel time, progressed by the half hour. Okay, yeah. So right down here, it's going up by a half hour. Related to driving or traveling over a certain amount of time, right? So there's obviously time. Something's happening with time here. I'm wondering what or who is traveling. Yeah, I don't know. Where are they going? What's happening here? That's a great wonder. Oh, nice. Sure. Is this one particular person? Is this an average? Like, what is this graph showing me? Well, between 11:30 and 12. Yeah. Why? What is happening there, right? Why does it go flat? What is happening? Oh, is it a car, bike, plane? And I might even ask, so Karen, why are you wondering that by looking at this graph? Why are you wondering if it's a car, bike, or plane? Would it change, you know, how in your mind might it change the graph if it's a car or a bike or a plane? Do you think it would look differently?
I originally thought it was a plane, but then I looked closer and it just says the number of miles traveled. So it would, but then I should have looked at the y-axis better. But yeah, just wondering. I guess yeah, it wouldn't help math related, but.
No, thank you. No, that's perfect, because right, that's what a student is doing. You're asking them to look at it and what are they thinking, and then you're diving into, right, and then you already here offer them, well, oh, because the axis, right? I wasn't looking at the axis. But for another student, they might be like, oh, well, I might think a plane, right? Because they take off, it's going to go straight up and then maybe level out, but this one seems to have more levels, or a car, right? So, or how fast they're going. So it's, again, it gets into that student thinking, again, where you can draw more language from, right? What were they noticing and what could have happened? Okay, good. Thank you. So again, just showing the chart, pulling out that language. And again, they could be using any sort of sentence frames that you have to describe this for them, because again, what we're focusing on here is not solving the problem, right? That's not what the goal is here. The goal is helping them provide the language so they can start to interpret the problems and make sense of them to persevere in solving them. Yes. Yes, Emily. Yep, right, exactly. And so again, too, right, you could show this to multi-level students. You could show this to a student who, right, is ESL, and you could just be asking them, like, what do you see? Oh, I see maybe, and maybe if they have the language, oh, it goes up by 5. But you could also have other students talking about the X and the Y axis and what that means and how those relate. So multiple levels of access here. Great, okay, so what I'm gonna ask you to do now is to go back into breakout groups. And the language is at the top of the screen here. I want you to think about your students and think about how they might use specific language. And it came up a little bit in the chat, but how would they use these specific phrases of faster or fastest, slower, slowest, and overall comparing, right? Something about the time frame. And again, a lot of this came up in the chat. I want you to push a little bit more and think about how your students might use some of these words to describe what they're seeing here on the screen. And now I'm also, right, showing the students. So they went for a bike ride, and this is the graph that they made of their bike ride. So Marisa, if you are ready, you can go ahead and start. So you'll have another 5 minutes to chat with each other about this, and then we'll come back and discuss this a little more. All right, welcome back again. Hopefully you were getting some more great conversation in your breakout room. So I'd like to invite, you know, 2 people maybe at this point in time who are willing to, you could either type in the chat or that you're willing to unmute and share anything that came out of that came out of this for you, or something that came out of in your breakout room about trying to use this language and thinking about these visuals.
So our group used all of the vocab you had listed. We got to all those points and comparing different time frames and how fast they were going. What was kind of fun at the end, we were saying this is what students would do as we were annotating the story. Like, what were they doing? Maybe they had a flat tire during that flat moment, you know, and yeah, so it was kind of funny.
Oh no, that's great. No, thank you for that. Yeah.
I mean, that's how we had to build a storyline, and it kind of made the word problem more fun. And that's kind of what students might do in the classroom too.
No, and thank you for that offering. That would be a magnificent way to use this. And especially if you have online students and are teaching in the virtual world right now, to put something up like that and then use the annotations or even allow the students to annotate would be a great way to get them to interact that way. And again, right, continuing to draw on that language, but then show it, like coming up with different storylines or making up their own story about the chart, right? That sounds super fun. I would have liked to have been in that breakout room.
Yeah, build reasoning. Yep. Makes
Yeah.
sense.
Exactly. Thank you, Lindsay. Yes, for saying like, right, why would that piece of the graph be flat? And thinking about that, what does that even mean? What does a flat line mean? Yes, and then just applying their imagination to it. Because a lot of times with charts and visuals, right, that's what we're asking students to do. Imagine what this is for. Imagine what this applies to. Anybody else who would like to share anything? Oh, yes. And yes, thank you again, Lindsay. So, right, because sometimes it might mean a constant speed, sometimes it might mean something stopped. So depending on the context, right, and again, applying that context here, right, we offered the context of, oh, they're riding bikes. But if we remove that again and you didn't know that, again, back to, right, the question of, oh, is it a car? Is it a plane? Is it a bike? What is it? Trying to think about that context because it could mean something different. And yes, thank you. Creativity with the facts expands thinking processes. Yes, exactly, Carol. Thank you guys so much for that. So, okay, so moving on then, if we now start to think about what happens when students actually have a word problem in front of them. And and yes, Vicki, right? It really lends itself well to teaching virtually because the world has changed and many of us are teaching online and not in the classroom. And so finding different ways to get students to interact virtually is really important to keep them engaged. And so again, here's a chart again. So, right, the first chart that I displayed was in thinking about how can I describe what I'm seeing? And then this chart is, right, where can I start if it's words in front of me? And again, same idea. So students and right in my classroom understand that there's the where can I start column and how can I describe this? And right, one way is right to start with is identifying what the problem is asking. What's been provided for me, what's missing. And so what we're going to do now, if you'll flip to the next screen, please, Lindsay, as we're coming to an end here. So instead of going into breakout rooms, I'm just going to ask everybody to take one moment to look at what's in front of you right now. And think about, so I do ask a question here, right? How many people had a 3-course meal? And however, instead of thinking about how, like solving it, like, oh, this is the answer, what I would ask students to do is use the chart, use the descriptions, and answer some of the questions. What is the unknown, right? What is, what is the unknown in this problem? Identifying that. The units that are unknown, and maybe what would a reasonable value be for the unknown, right? Is it going to be $1,000? Is it going to be $3? And starting to think about reasonable and what that means. And so feel free, so we'll just take a couple of minutes here in looking at this, what's on the screen. And you can either unmute, or if you want to type something in the chat, that might be easier in this instance to unmute and share. But just answering some of these questions, right? What is the unknown? And or if you want to step outside of your student hat at this point, and from a teacher perspective, if there are additional questions that you don't see here that you might think to ask your students, or something along those lines. So feel free to either unmute and share, or if there's something you want to type in the chat, that's fine too. Yes, thank you, Emily. So like the unknown, how many people out of the 10 had a 3-course meal, right? And then again, right, you could be going back all the way back to even if you're using a routine about language, oh, that's a group. We have 2 groups, right? We have a group of 10 and then a group of 3 out of that 10, right? Again, back to that language and then thinking about making sense of the problem. Yeah, that's the unknown of the problem, right? Can we draw a picture of this? Can we draw a model? And in thinking, right, if they've been exposed to the models up to this point, can we draw something to represent this? Yeah, I can show this by drawing a diagram. Absolutely, right? Again, drawing back on those previous instances where we've maybe showed our students graphs or had them work on number lines or breaking apart groups or putting them back together, annotating the screen. How can I put all of these things together? Because again, the main goal that we had here was making sense of the problem to persevere, right? But making sense of it is that first hump that students really, really struggle with. And so the goal is not to get them to solve this or come up with an equation, but to really think about how can they make sense of this using language and drawing on that language. All right. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Paulina. So make a chart, right? $15, so $1, $15, $2, $30, $3, $45. Excellent, yes. Absolutely, right? So all the different ways that you can access these problems and get students to access these problems by using that language. All right, so we are almost at the end of our time here together. So we're gonna debrief and wrap up. Go ahead and quickly either raise your hand or unmute. And what is at least one way you foresee the work that we did today and discussed today informing your future practice? And or what questions do you have? So is there a copy of the chart and questions available? Yes, so there will be, first of all, and in our slideshow here, will be in the presentation folders and participant folders, and you'll get a PDF. Yep, so you'll get a PDF of the slides. And then there's also links. So we have a resources page attached to this presentation that has links to everything that we talked about here today. Great question, Tanya. Thank you for that. So I plan on using my math patterns, relationships, and connection with grammar. Excellent. Oh, now they're all rolling in. Yes. Connections. Yep. Great. Oh, good. All right, Karen, you're starting to teach GED next week. Yes, building that language. Oh, awesome. Yeah, please use it. Please take pictures of the chart, use the chart, make your own chart. Oh, good. I'm glad that you all, it sounds like everybody is thinking, right? Providing the sentence frames, glossary, teaching them, starting with graphs or number lines. Yeah, and using visuals of problems. That's great. So before we are out of time here, there's some upcoming PD that you should be aware of. And then also, and you'll see it in our slide deck as well on the PDF, we have a resources page too that has links to all of the things that we went over today.
Yes, and I just want to say a quick note about the March 1st tips and strategies for adult education math tutors. This is a a presentation that I am doing in collaboration with Rob Polasic from Literacy Minnesota. It is geared towards math volunteers. So please encourage your volunteers to attend. If they haven't gone through a training recently, this is a brand new training, kind of principles for teaching math at any level. And then also if you're interested in what are we telling math volunteers about math learning, whether it's they're helping you in your language classroom, but you're doing some numeracy instruction, what are some main principles we want to keep in mind? You could also attend if you're interested in hearing what we're sharing. So these links will be in the slide for you to check out these events and register. So, and then like Meagan said, yes, we also have some links to resources that we used for these activities. So thank you very much for coming. And
thank you all for your amazing participation.
Yes.
Really, like this session wouldn't work without you. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, it was very fun to hear your ideas. So
thanks so much, everyone.